The morning Phineas Hayes found the land survey stakes driven into the red earth along his eastern fence line. He stood over them for a long time with his hat pushed back on his head, and a feeling in his chest that he could not quite name, something between irritation and the very first tremor of a life that had been perfectly still for years beginning, at last, to move again. Phineas was 34 years old in the autumn of 1878, and he had lived alone on his 240 acres of New Mexico Territory land for the better part of 6 years. The spread sat in a wide and golden valley south of Santa Fe, where the Sangre de Cristo mountains rolled purple and vast along the eastern horizon, and the afternoon smelled of juniper and cooling dust. He ran about 40 head of cattle, kept a vegetable garden that fed him adequately if not generously, maintained a small barn, a good strong corral, and a house that was clean enough but had the unmistakable quality of a place where no woman had ever arranged the furniture with intention. The chairs were wherever they ended up. The curtains, what there were of them, hung crooked. A single coffee mug sat perpetually beside the wash basin because it was the only one he ever used. He had not always been this way. There had been a woman named Clara 7 years ago in Texas, and they had been engaged to be married in the spring. Clara had died of a fever in February, fast and terrible, and without any mercy at all, and the man who had walked away from her grave was a fundamentally different creature from the one who had courted her. That man had made his peace with a quiet and empty life, the way a person makes peace with a scar, not happily, not proudly, but permanently. The quiet was easier than hoping. The emptiness had fewer sharp edges than grief. So when he found those survey stakes on a Tuesday morning in October while he was checking his eastern fence for breaks, his first instinct was simply annoyance. The parcel of land bordering his to the east had been sitting vacant for years, owned by a railroad company that had never done anything with it. 160 acres of good grass and a seasonal creek that swelled beautifully in spring. He had always half hoped to purchase it himself one day, to expand his herd. Apparently, someone had beaten him to it. He pulled one of the stakes from the ground and turned it in his fingers. It was freshly cut, the wood pale and clean, with a small strip of red cloth tied at the top. Professional surveyor's work. Whoever had filed the claim had done it properly through the land office in Santa Fe. This was not some squatter. This was someone with documents. He dropped the stake back into its hole, pushed it down with the heel of his boot, and rode back to his house. For 2 weeks nothing further happened. The stakes remained. No one appeared. Phineas told himself it did not concern him. He repaired 3 sections of fence along the northern boundary, treated one of his cattle for a hoof problem, and traded a side of dried venison to his nearest neighbor, old Miguel Reyes, who lived 4 miles west and made the best corn tortillas in the territory. Miguel was 60-something and widowed and perfectly content, and the two of them would sit on Miguel's porch on Sunday afternoons and not talk very much, which suited them both extremely well. It was Miguel who mentioned it first, on the last Sunday of October, with the mountains going pink in the fading afternoon light. "Someone has bought the Hargrove parcel," Miguel said, using the old name for the land the railroad had owned. He said it the way he said most things, as a quiet observation with a small sip of coffee after. "I know," Phineas said. "I found the stakes." "A woman," Miguel said. Phineas looked at him. "Roberto told me. His boy works at the land office." Miguel set his coffee cup down on the rail of the porch. "A woman from back east," he said. "Kansas, maybe. She came in with a full claim, all the money, all the papers, filed it herself. No husband." "That right," Phineas said, and it was not a question. "That is what Roberto said." Miguel picked his coffee back up. "Should be interesting." Phineas did not say anything to that. He watched the mountains go from pink to purple to dark, and then he rode home in the early dark under a sky that was absolutely brilliant with stars, and he thought about it more than he wanted to admit. A woman alone, 160 acres of undeveloped land. In the New Mexico Territory in October, with winter coming. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that all the way home, and again while he was unsaddling his horse, and one more time for good measure while he was eating his supper alone at his table in his quiet house, with the single coffee mug sitting by the wash basin and the crooked curtains hanging in the windows. She arrived on a Thursday. He heard the wagon before he saw it, the creak and rumble of a fully loaded freight wagon coming down the old track that ran along the eastern edge of his property, which was also the western edge of the Hargrove parcel. He was in the corral working with a young horse when the sound reached him, and he paused, resting one hand on the horse's flank, and listened. Then he saw it. A single wagon, canvas-covered and packed high, drawn by a pair of sturdy draft horses that looked well cared for, bay-colored with good feet. And on the seat of that wagon, holding the reins with what he could already see was competent ease, sat a woman. She was not what he had imagined, though he had told himself he had not imagined anything. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed felt hat that had seen weather and was not ashamed of it. She wore a practical dark coat over a work dress, and her face, even at this distance, had a quality of complete and focused attention. She was watching where her horses were going, reading the ground ahead of them, calculating the turn she would need to make to get through the gap in the old rock formation that marked the entrance to the parcel. She made the turn perfectly. Phineas watched her disappear behind the tree line without knowing quite why he was still watching. He finished with the horse. He fed his cattle. He made his supper. He went to bed. The next morning he told himself he was going to check his eastern fence line because it was responsible land stewardship. The fact that it was also his property boundary with the newly claimed parcel was simply geography. He rode out at 7 in the morning with the frost still silver on the grass and found her already at work. She had made camp near the seasonal creek, in a spot that showed good judgment, protected from the north wind by a rise of land, close to water, on ground that was flat and solid. The wagon had been partially unloaded. A canvas tent had been erected, well staked. She was driving fence posts with a manual post driver, working with a steady and rhythmic effort that made it clear she had done this before. He sat on his horse at the fence line and watched for a moment, and then, because he was not an impolite man, he called out, "Morning." She stopped. She was breathing hard from the work, her cheeks flushed from the cold air and the exertion, and she shaded her eyes with one hand to look at him across the fence line. Even with the distance and the morning light, he could see that her eyes were striking some shade between green and gray that he could not precisely identify. "Morning," she called back. He dismounted. He walked to the fence line, took off his hat. "Phineas Hayes, I own the property to your west." She pulled off her work glove and walked toward him across the frost-stiff grass. She stopped on her side of the fence and offered her hand across it. "Lenora Abbott, I believe we are going to be neighbors." Her handshake was firm and direct. Her hand was already calloused, which he noticed without meaning to. "Looks that way," he said. "You drove up from Santa Fe." "From Albuquerque," she said. "I came in from Dodge City by train, then took the stage to Albuquerque, then hired this wagon and drove up. 4 days on the road." She said it simply, without complaint, as though 4 days alone on a wagon road through New Mexico territory in late October were a reasonable and unremarkable thing. "You came alone," he said, and he heard himself say it and knew it was perhaps too direct. She met his eyes without any flicker of defensiveness. "I did," he nodded. He put his hat back on. "Well, if you need anything, the road to Santa Fe cuts northwest from your front boundary. I'm 4 miles west. Neighbor to the further west is Miguel Reyes, good man, helpful." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said. "Phineas is fine." She nodded. "Lenora, then." He rode back to his property thinking about the way she had looked at him, direct and measuring and entirely unimpressed, as though she had made assessments of men in her life before and had developed efficient methods for it. He found he did not mind being assessed. Over the following week, he observed her, in the way that a man who lives alone in a landscape cannot help but observe the thing that has changed in that landscape. She worked from sunup to sundown. He could see the dust of it and sometimes hear it, the sound of post driving, the sound of an axe on wood, the occasional direction she called to her draft horses in a clear carrying voice. She was building a shelter for winter, something more permanent than the canvas tent, and she was doing it fast. On the 8th day after her arrival, he rode along his eastern fence line and found her standing on her side of it, looking at something in the creek with an expression that he read from 20 yards as controlled frustration. He stopped. "Something wrong." She looked up. She had been here 8 days, and already the sun had deepened the color along her cheekbones. "My creek has dropped," she said. "I was counting on it for water through the winter. I know it is a seasonal creek, but it should not be this low in late October. I am wondering whether something upstream is blocking it." Phineas dismounted and tied his horse to a fence post and crossed through the gate. There was a gate in the fence that the previous landowners had installed decades ago for shared access to the creek, and he had a key to the padlock on his side. He walked to the creek bank and crouched down beside her and looked at the water. She was right. It was low, too low. "There is a beaver dam that forms sometimes about 2 miles up in the canyon," he said. "Knocks down the flow every few years. I can take you up there to look." She turned her head and looked at him, and he was close enough now that he could see her eyes properly, and they were definitively green with small flecks of darker color like moss on a creek stone. "You would do that. We share this creek," he said, which was true. "I have an interest in it running right." They rode up the canyon that afternoon, through stands of pale cottonwood and bare-armed scrub oak, following the creek bed into the narrowing canyon. The beaver dam was there, exactly as he remembered, plugging the canyon and backing up a substantial pool of deep greenish water. They spent 2 hours dismantling the lower section of it, cold, wet, muddy work, and by the time the water was moving strongly again, she was soaked to the elbow and had creek mud on her face and was laughing. The sound of it surprised him. Not the laugh itself, it was clear and genuine and nothing remarkable, but the way it landed on him, the way it found some quiet hollow space inside his chest and rang there briefly like a struck bell. "That is absolutely disgusting, and I am very grateful," she said, looking at her mud-covered arms with an expression of cheerful horror. "There's a deeper pool about a 1/4 mile down where you can rinse off," he said. They rinsed off in the pool, side by side on the bank, scrubbing mud from their arms with the cold, clear water. The afternoon light was coming slanted and gold through the cottonwoods, and the creek was running properly now, and he told himself later that whatever he had felt in that moment was nothing more than the satisfaction of a practical problem being solved. He was lying, but he was not yet ready to know that. She invited him to supper, and he almost declined out of habit, but she was already moving toward her campfire with the easy authority of a woman who did not issue invitations she was not certain about. And so he tied his horse and sat on a camp stool and watched her cook over an open fire with a cast iron skillet that she handled as though it were an extension of herself. The food was simple salt pork, dried beans she had soaked overnight, cornbread in a Dutch oven, but it was well made and hot, and they ate it as the stars came out over the canyon rim, and the temperature dropped and the fire became the center of everything. "Why New Mexico?" he asked. It had been his primary question since he had first heard she was coming, and it seemed the moment had arrived to ask it. She was quiet for a moment, her tin plate in her hands, her eyes on the fire. "I was in Kansas for 3 years," she said. "Dodge City, then a small town outside of Wichita. I was teaching school." She paused. "My father died 2 years ago and left me a small inheritance. Not a great deal of money, but enough. And I thought—" She stopped and started again. "I have wanted land of my own for a long time. Not to be on someone else's land, or in someone else's town, or in a school that belongs to a board of men who tell me what I am permitted to teach. I wanted something that was mine." She looked up from the fire and met his eyes. "Is that sensible?" "Yes," he said without any hesitation. She smiled, and it was a small and private smile, as though she had not been certain of his answer and was pleased by it. "Some people told me it was foolish. A woman alone, undeveloped land." "No," she gestured vaguely. No husband to do the heavy work. You drove those fence posts yourself, he said. I did, she said. Didn't look like you needed a husband to do it. She looked at him for a moment, assessing again, and then the smile widened slightly. No, she said, I do not suppose I did. He rode home under the stars thinking that he should not go back for a while, that it was better to let her settle, to give her the space she had clearly sought out and valued, that whatever had happened to the interior of his chest on that creek bank was a novelty response to the presence of another person after considerable solitude and nothing more. He was back the following Tuesday. He told himself he was returning a fence tool she had borrowed, which was true. He had lent her a post-hole digger, and she had said she would leave it at the gate when she was done, and he needed it back. This was entirely practical. She was on the roof of a small structure she had been building, a storage building, timber-framed, and she was up there laying the first course of sod on the roof with a confidence that made his stomach tighten just slightly, because the pitch of the roof was not trivial and she was working alone. You should have someone steadying that ladder, he said, loudly enough to be heard. She looked down from the roof with an expression that was not unfriendly but was plainly unamused by the implication. I have been climbing ladders unassisted since I was 7 years old. The ladder is on uneven ground, he said. She looked down at it. She looked back at him. He could see her evaluating the information, separating it from what she had initially read as unsolicited advice and weighing it on its merits. You are right, she said. It is tilted about 2 inches. If you would like to be useful, you could put a flat stone under the left foot of it. He found a flat stone. He put it under the left foot of the ladder. He spent the next 3 hours handing her sod sections and mixed clay mortar from the ground while she laid the roof. And they talked about things in the way that people talk when their hands are busy, easily, without the self-consciousness of formal conversation. He learned that she was 28, that she had grown up in Ohio, that she had 2 younger brothers still back east, that she had read everything she could get her hands on since childhood and missed access to books more than almost anything else about her previous life. He learned that she was a practical and competent and determined person who had thought hard about what she was doing and made her decisions with clear eyes, but who also laughed easily at the right things and asked questions with genuine attention, and had the quality, rare in any person, of listening as though what you were saying genuinely mattered to her. He told her things he had not told anyone in years. About the valley and how it changed through the seasons. About the way the spring grass came up so thick and green it looked painted. About the wild turkey that had been living in his north woodlot for 3 years, that he had named Samuel for no good reason, and that had developed a habit of appearing at inopportune moments and startling his horse. He did not mention Clara. He was not yet ready to mention Clara. She asked about the territory, about the Pueblo people who lived in the villages to the north. He told her what he knew, which was not a great deal, but what he knew he had learned respectfully, from the people themselves and from Miguel, who spoke more knowledgeable of such things. He told her about the tensions that still marked the land, the Navajo people who had been forced on the long walk to Bosque Redondo only 15 years before, and returned to their land at Cañon de Chelly, a wrong that had been acknowledged, though never adequately repaired, and whose effects still ran through the territory like an underground river. He told her about it directly and without softening it, and she listened with a quality of serious attention that he respected. I want to know the land I am on, she said. All of it, not just the parts that are comfortable to know. He looked at her. That is a better attitude than most settlers bring with them. I am not interested in pretending history is different from what it is, she said simply. He thought about that for a long time on his ride home, and then he thought about other things, which were less philosophical and more to do with the way she had looked in the slant afternoon light with mortar dust on her coat. November arrived, cold and sharp, with frost on every morning and the smell of snow in the high peaks. Lenora's storage building was complete. She had begun work on her main house, a small but properly constructed structure timber frame, with a stone foundation that she was laying herself, hauling rock from an outcropping on the eastern edge of her parcel. Phineas came by every few days, always with some practical pretext, and always ended up working beside her for most of the afternoon. He was not fooling himself about why he was there, exactly. But he was not yet ready to do anything about it, and she gave no indication of expecting him to. She was pleasant and open and direct in a way that invited friendship, and offered nothing more unless he could read something in certain pauses and certain looks that he might have been projecting entirely from his own wishful interpretation. He brought her a cord of split firewood one morning in early November, arriving with his wagon loaded and beginning to unstack it near her tent before she came out and found him at it. "I did not ask for that," she said, "but there was no heat in it." "I know," he said. "Winter comes fast here. That canvas tent is not going to be enough." "I know that," she said. "I have ordered a stove from Santa Fe. It should arrive by the end of the month." "Until it does," he said, gesturing at the firewood. She stood in the cold morning air looking at him for a moment, with her hair loose around her shoulders because she had just come out of the tent and had not yet pinned it. This was the first time he had seen her with her hair down, and it fell to the middle of her back, a deep and beautiful auburn color in the flat gray morning light, and he looked at it exactly as long as he could reasonably justify before finding something else to look at. "Thank you, Phineas," she said, quietly and directly in a way that meant it. "You're welcome, Lenora," he said, equally quiet, and went on unloading the firewood. It was Miguel who said what no one had said out loud yet. This was one of Miguel's particular gifts, the ability to name the thing in the room that everyone was carefully not naming, and to do it with such complete neutrality that it could not quite be taken as intrusive. It was a Sunday afternoon in mid-November, the two of them on Miguel's porch with coffee, and Phineas had mentioned somewhat more times than was strictly necessary for informational purposes various details about the progress of Lenora Abbott's homestead. Miguel had listened to all of it with perfect, composed attention. Then he said, "You like her?" Phineas was quiet for a moment. "She is a good neighbor." Miguel agreed. "And you like her?" Phineas turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside, the gray afternoon light lay across Miguel's yard, and his small herd of goats moved along the hillside with patient unconcern. "It has been a long time," Phineas said, which was not a denial. "Yes," Miguel said, "it has been a very long time." "Clara," Phineas started and then stopped. "Clara has been gone for 7 years," Miguel said, gently but plainly. "She would not want this for you, Phineas." This, he made a brief and eloquent gesture with one hand that somehow encompassed the entirety of the past 6 years of Phineas's solitary life. "You did not know Clara," Phineas said, but without any real argumentative feeling. "No," Miguel said, "but I know you, and I know that this, the gesture again, is not who you are. It is what you have made yourself out of grief. Those are different things." Phineas drank his coffee. The goats moved along the hillside. The mountains were gray and pale and very still. "She came all the way from Kansas by herself," Phineas said. "She drove fence posts and laid a stone foundation, and she is building her own house. She does not need anyone." "Perhaps not," Miguel said, "but needing and wanting are different things, too." The first snow came on the 20th of November. Phineas woke to 3 inches on the ground and more coming down, the sky a solid low white, the world gone quiet the way it only goes quiet under snow. He went through his morning chores quickly, and then he saddled his horse and rode east. He found Lenora's camp transformed by white, which was beautiful, and her tent weighted down with snow, which was concerning. She was outside in her coat and boots, beating the snow off the tent canvas with a broom handle to reduce the load, her breath making white clouds in the cold air. She had clearly been up for some time. The camp fire was burning. "The stove should have arrived already," she said, when she saw him ride up, and there was something in her voice that was not quite frustration but was adjacent to it, the sound of a person who had planned carefully and found the world unwilling to cooperate. "Still in Santa Fe, I expect," he said. "Weather may have slowed the wagon." She stopped beating the tent and looked at it, and he could see her doing the mathematics of it. Cold, canvas tent, winter properly arrived, stove delayed, house not yet complete. Her expression was controlled and practical, but there was something underneath it that she was holding in with considerable effort. "Lenora," he said, "come and stay at my place until the stove arrives and the house is ready." She looked at him. "I have a spare room," he said, which was true. His house had 2 rooms, the main room where he cooked and sat, and a back room he used for storage and which had a bed in it that had never been used in 6 years. "It has a bed and a stove. It is warm." She was quiet for a long moment. He could see her weighing it, the independence she prized against the physical reality of a New Mexico winter in a canvas tent. "I cannot leave my horses and my goods," she said. "Your horses can come into my barn. Your wagon will be fine. I will help you move your valuables over. What is here will keep." She looked at the snow coming down. She looked at her tent. She looked at him. "2 weeks at most," she said, "until the stove arrives and I can get back in." "However long you need," he said. They spent the morning moving her horses to his barn and her trunk and important supplies to his wagon. She set up in his spare room with a quiet efficiency that made no fuss, asked him where the wash basin water came from and whether he had a preference about times of morning when she used the kitchen, and thanked him plainly and without excessive feeling. That first evening they cooked supper together, or rather she cooked while he set the table and cut the bread, and they ate across from each other at his table in his house, where no one had ever sat across from him, and the difference was so enormous and so immediate that he spent part of the meal looking at his plate, just to have something to look at that was not her face lit by the lamplight. She noticed his bookshelves, 2 rough shelves above the fireplace that held perhaps 15 books, accumulated over years and deeply read, the spines worn. She went to look at them after supper while he washed the plates. "You read," she said, and her voice had a quality of genuine and unguarded pleasure. "When I can get hold of something worth reading," he said. She pulled out his copy of Moby Dick, which was the most battered of them all, and turned it in her hands. "I have read this 3 times, she said. 4, he said. She looked at him over her shoulder with an expression he could not name but wanted to keep looking at. "I have a copy of Middlemarch in my trunk," she said, "and a collection of Longfellow's poetry. I will add them to the shelf while I am here." "I would appreciate that," he said. Living in close quarters with Lenora Abbott was a revelation. She was neat and organized and entirely comfortable with herself. She did not apologize for taking up space or for having opinions about things, but she was also genuinely considerate, asking before she changed anything, carrying her share of the household work without discussion or complaint. She had a habit of reading in the evening after supper, sitting close to the lamp with one foot tucked under her in a way that seemed deeply unconscious, and sometimes she would read a passage aloud to him, not because she was performing, but because she had come to a thing that delighted her and wanted to share it. And this was so natural and so comfortable that he began to look forward to those evenings with a specificity and intensity that alarmed him somewhat. She had, he discovered, a strong sense of humor that she deployed with excellent timing. She observed things about him, about the landscape, about the horses with a precision that was always kind but never sentimental. She talked to the horses in a way that was entirely without self-consciousness, having full conversations with them in a conversational tone, and when he pointed this out she said, "They understand more than you might think, and it helps me organize my own thoughts," in a tone that indicated this was not up for debate. One evening about a week into her stay, a sudden fierce wind came up from the north, banging the shutters and sending the temperature plummeting. She had gone to check on her horses in the barn after supper and had been out longer than expected, and he had put his coat on and gone out to make sure everything was well, and found her in the barn with her big bay mare who had been spooked by the wind, standing at the mare's head with both hands on the horse's face and talking to her in a low, steady voice, entirely calm and focused, entirely sufficient. He stood in the barn door and watched her for a moment. This woman in the lamplight, standing in a cold barn in a snowstorm talking down a frightened horse, and something happened inside him that was not a small thing at all. It was quiet and complete, and it settled into him like a foundation stone being set into good ground. He had not felt this in 7 years. He had, in fact, convinced himself he was no longer capable of it. He cleared his throat so as not to startle her and walked in to help hold the horse's halter, and she looked at him with a quick, grateful look that was absolutely not the cause of his feeling, but that deepened it further regardless. "Thank you," she said. She was worked up. "Happens with that wind," he said. "She'll settle." They stood together in the warm, lamp-smelling dark of the barn, with the wind screaming outside and the horse between them, gradually growing still and quiet. And neither of them said anything for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence Phineas Hayes had experienced in 6 years. In the second week of her stay, she asked him about Clara. They were sitting by the fire after supper, she with Middlemark, he with his own thoughts, and out of one of their easy silences she said, "Miguel mentioned that you had a loss some years ago. If you do not want to talk about it, please tell me so." He was quiet for a moment. He had known it would come up eventually. "Her name was Clara," he said. "We were engaged to be married. She died of a fever about a month before our wedding. It was in the winter of 1871. Lenora put her book down. She was looking at him with that complete attention that he had come to value so much. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "It was a long time ago," he said. "That does not make it a lesser thing," she said quietly. He looked at the fire. "No," he said, "it does not. Is that why you are here, in the territory?" "I needed to go somewhere I had not been with her," he said. "Somewhere that did not have her in every street and every room. I had family in Texas, but Texas was it was still close. So I came here." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I did not really intend to stay as long as I have. And yet here you are," she said, and it was not pointed, simply an observation. "Here I am," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I was engaged once also." He looked at her. "His name was Robert Aldrich, in Wichita. He was a perfectly good man, and I thought I loved him." She looked at the fire. 2 weeks before the wedding, I understood that what I felt for him was respect and affection and familiarity, and that marrying him would be very comfortable and would slowly and thoroughly suffocate me, because he wanted a specific kind of wife and a specific kind of life, and that was not me. I called it off." She looked up at him briefly, and her expression was clear and steady. "It was considered a great scandal. His family was furious. My mother was devastated." A small pause. "But it was the right thing. I knew who I was, and I would not pretend otherwise." He held her gaze. "What made you sure?" he asked. "I asked myself whether I was frightened of losing him," she said, "and I was not. I was more frightened of staying." He thought about that. He thought about Clara and about the terror of that winter and about 6 years of choosing the quiet over the risk of that terror again. "I have been frightened of the opposite," he said carefully. She looked at him. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had died and the night was still and very cold. "I know," she said, "just that." And then she picked up Middlemark again, gently, and he sat with his coffee and his fire, and the feeling of something that had been held very tight inside him for a very long time beginning, at last, to loosen. On the 15th day, the wagon from Santa Fe arrived with her stove. He helped her load it onto her wagon and drive it out to her parcel, and they spent a full day getting it into the house. Her house, which she had gotten far enough along that the 4 walls and the roof were complete, though the interior was rough and needed much finishing. They set the stove in the kitchen corner, ran the pipe through the hole she had already cut in the roof, and when they got it lit and the warmth began to spread through the small space, she stood in the middle of her own floor with her hands open at her sides, and her face turned slightly toward the heat, and an expression on her face that was so privately joyful that Phineas felt he was seeing something he was not supposed to see, something that belonged entirely to her. "Your house," he said. She looked at him, and her eyes were bright. "My house," she said. with a weight and warmth in the words that told him more about what she had been carrying for years than anything she had said directly. He helped her move back that afternoon, bringing her trunk and her belongings across in his wagon, getting her settled. Before he left, she made tea on her new stove, the first thing cooked in it, and they stood in her small, rough house with their cups and drank it, and the light through the windows was the low gold of winter afternoon. "I am grateful," she said, "for the firewood and the room and everything else." "I was glad to," he said. She was looking at him with something in her eyes that was not quite the direct and assessing look she usually gave him, something a degree more open and more uncertain, and he recognized it because he felt it too. He put his hat on. "I'll come by Saturday to help with the interior finishing, if you want an extra pair of hands." "I would like that," she said. He rode home with the cold air on his face and the knowledge sitting in his chest, warm and entirely without ambiguity, that he was well and thoroughly lost on the subject of Lenora Abbott. December came in with a week of hard cold that froze the creek over at the margins and put ice in the cattle's water troughs every morning. Phineas and Lenora fell into a rhythm that neither of them had designed, but that both of them maintained. He came to her place on Saturdays to work on the house finishing. She came to his place on Wednesdays to borrow books and to help him with the preserved food cataloging that she had noted was extremely disorganized. They ran into each other at the creek most mornings, as both of them checked on it during the freeze, and they would stand on the bank for a while and talk in the cold before going to their separate days. He brought her to meet Miguel on a Sunday in early December, and Miguel greeted her with the courteous and genuine warmth that was his natural character, and within 20 minutes was showing her his garden in the cold, explaining what he grew and how. And Lenora was asking questions with that complete attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting. And Phineas sat on the porch and watched them and felt a happiness that was so clean and simple it was almost unfamiliar to him. On the ride back from Miguel's, with the sun going down and turning the mountains brilliant and cold, Lenora was quiet for a while in the way she was when she was thinking through something. "He is remarkable," she said. "He is," Phineas said. "He said something to me while we were in the garden," she said. "He said," she paused, considering whether to say it. "He said that you have been a good man for a long time in a very quiet way and that it was good to see you riding somewhere with someone." Phineas looked at the mountains. "He said it very kindly," Lenora added. "Miguel is usually kind," Phineas said. They rode on for a moment. Their horses moved together easily, having been ridden alongside each other enough times that they had established a comfortable working relationship. "It has been good," Phineas said, carefully. "These past weeks, the company." "Yes," she said, matching his careful tone, "it has been. He started and stopped. I had gotten to a point where I had stopped expecting things to change. I think I had decided the way things were was the way they would remain." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her. The evening light was on her face and she was looking at him directly, without any deflection, with those green and complicated eyes, and he thought of what she had said by his fire. "I asked myself whether I was frightened of losing him, and I was not," and he knew the answer to that question, as it applied to himself and to her, with absolute and terrifying certainty. "Now I find I am hoping for things again," he said, "which is somewhat alarming to me." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," she said. He did not say more and she did not ask for more, but when they reached the fork where her track diverged from his toward her parcel, she stopped and looked at him in the fading light. "Good night, Phineas," she said. "Good night, Lenora," he said. She turned her horse toward her land and rode away, and he watched her go until she was gone among the trees. And then he rode home and sat by his fire with a book. He did not read for 2 hours, just thinking. The event that changed the temperature between them from careful warmth to something neither of them could continue to navigate carefully came on an afternoon in mid-December, and it involved trouble that Phineas had been quietly expecting, but hoping would not materialize. There was a man named Dodge Prout, not the city, just the name, God-given or chosen. No one was entirely sure, who claimed to hold a prior water right on the creek that ran through both properties. This claim was of dubious legality and had never been tested because the creek had run through empty land for years, but Prout owned a mid-sized ranch 6 miles to the south and had used the Upper Creek water freely, and the arrival of 2 operating homesteads on its lower reaches threatened his assumption of unlimited access. Prout was not a villain from a dime novel. He was a rough and practical man in his mid-50s, weathered and hard, with no history of violence but a well-established history of considering his own interests paramount and pursuing them with considerable persistence. He rode onto Lenora's property on a Tuesday afternoon while Phineas was there helping her install window frames, and he was accompanied by 2 of his cowboys. He did not announce himself, just rode to within 10 feet of the house front and called out, and when Lenora came to the door she found 3 men on horses in her yard and no preamble. "Miss Abbott," Prout said, "I understand you've been drawing from the creek regular." "I have water rights established in my land claim," she said. She had come to the door holding a hammer which she had been using on the window frames, and she did not put it down. "Registered at the land office in Santa Fe." "I hold a prior claim on that water," Prout said. "Do you have a document to that effect?" she asked. Prout shifted in his saddle. "That water has been mine by use for 15 years. "That is not the same thing as a document," she said. Phineas had come to stand behind Lenora in the doorway, and Prout saw him and his eyes moved from her to him and back again with a speculative calculation that Phineas recognized. "Hayes," Prout said, acknowledging him. "Prout," Phineas said. "You share this same creek." "I do," Phineas said, "and I have had water rights registered in my land claim for 6 years. The land office in Santa Fe will have both records if you would like to review them." Prout looked at him for a long moment. He was a practical man and he did the mathematics. 2 established claims, both registered, both legal. His own claim, which existed in his assumption and his 15 years of unchallenged use, and precisely nowhere else. "I expect there's going to be a reckoning on this," he said, but it was the kind of statement that covered a retreat. He pulled his horse around and his 2 cowboys followed, and they rode back south. Lenora stood in her doorway watching them go, and Phineas stood behind her close enough that he could see the line of tension in her shoulders and could tell the exact moment it went out of them. "Thank you for standing there," she said. "I was already there," he said. She turned, and he was closer than expected because the doorway was not wide, and for a moment they were very near each other in the thin winter light, and he could see everything in her expression, the tightness left by the confrontation and the calm she had deployed during it, and underneath both of those things something that was warm and direct and unmistakably personal and aimed at him. "He has no legal claim," she said. "I will go to Santa Fe before the end of the week and speak to the land office." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him. "You do not need to. I'll come with you," he said again, quietly but without any ambiguity. She held his eyes for a moment. "All right," she said. They rode to Santa Fe 2 days later, a full day's journey, and spent a morning in the land office going through the water rights records with the territorial clerk, a careful and helpful man named Aldous Webb who knew his records extremely well. The case was entirely clear. Both Hayes and Abbott held properly registered downstream water rights. Prout's claim of prior use had no legal standing under territorial law, which had moved steadily toward documented claims and away from use-based rights in the preceding decade. Webb confirmed this in writing and gave Lenora a formal letter to that effect. They ate lunch at a restaurant on the plaza in Santa Fe, a proper sit-down meal at an actual table with a tablecloth, which was such a departure from their daily circumstances that it had a slightly festive quality. The restaurant had tamales and pasol and strong coffee, and Lenora ate with the appetite of someone who had been living on camp cooking for weeks and was genuinely glad of the variation. She was wearing her best dress, which she had put on for the business meeting, a deep blue wool that made her eyes look very green, and she had her hair pinned up properly, and she was so fundamentally and straightforwardly beautiful that Phineas spent a quiet and productive portion of the meal reminding himself to make conversation rather than simply look at her. "Can I ask you something?" he said over coffee. "Yes," she said. "Are you happy here, with how it has been going?" He meant the land, the work, the choice she had made, but he was aware as he asked it that the question had more range than that. She considered it seriously, the way she considered everything. "I am," she said. "More than I expected to be." A pause. "More than I have been in I'm not sure how long." She looked at him. "I did not expect to find good company when I came here. I expected to be alone, and I had made my peace with that expectation." "So had I," he said. She smiled at him across the table, and it was the fullest smile she had given him, unguarded and warm and entirely for him. "We are perhaps not as good at peace as we thought," she said. They stayed the night in Santa Fe, 2 separate rooms at a respectable boarding house, and started back in the morning before dawn. The road back south through the high desert was cold and bright, the mountains enormous on their left, the sky an absolute and brilliant blue, and they rode most of it in the easy silence that was one of Phineas's favorite things about being with her, because it was a silence that had the same quality as speech. It was full, not empty. It was chosen and comfortable. It was company. At the midpoint of the ride, on a wide stretch of flat ground where the road curved through a stand of juniper, he said her name. She looked at him. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plainness." She reined her horse to a walk. He did the same. "I have been very glad of you," he said. "These weeks, more glad than I know quite what to do with. And I know that you came here for your land and your independence and that those things are important to you and they should be." He paused. "I am not asking you to give any of that up. I am not asking you to be less than what you are." He looked at her directly. "But I find that I am in love with you, Lenora, and it seemed wrong to know that without telling you." The horses moved through the juniper scrub, and the morning light was pale and clean across the whole wide landscape. And she was quiet for a moment that was long enough to make his heart beat in a pronounced and inconvenient way. Then she said, "I have been in love with you since the afternoon we cleared the beaver dam and you made me laugh in the middle of that cold creek." He looked at her. She met his eyes with the same directness she brought to everything. "I was not sure what to do about it either," she said. "You are not the most approachable person in the world, Phineas Hayes." "I have been told," he said, by which he meant he had not been told in years because no one had been close enough to tell him, and she seemed to understand this because she smiled. He pulled his horse to a stop, and so did she. There in the middle of the road with the juniper all around, and the mountains behind them and the whole wide, empty, beautiful territory stretched out before them, and he leaned across from his saddle and she leaned toward him and he kissed her, and it was warm and real and certain, the way things are when they are right rather than merely wished for. When they broke apart, she was still close, her eyes bright in the cold air. "I am still keeping my land," she said. "I know," he said. "And my name," she said. "I would not want you to change it," he said, and then he thought about it and said, "Unless you wanted to, in which case." She laughed, and he kissed her again because the laugh was wonderful and he was allowed to now. They rode home side by side through the brilliant winter afternoon, and for the first time in 6 years, Phineas Hayes was not riding toward the quiet but away from it, toward something warm and real and entirely his. The winter progressed, and with it everything changed in the texture of their days, changed and deepened, and became something richer and more specific than what had come before. He helped her finish her house, and it became, under her arrangement, a beautiful small place, practical and warm, and filled with her books and her careful touches. The curtains she had sewn herself hung straight and full, the furniture placed with intention, dried flowers from the autumn hanging in a bundle near the window. He saw his own house differently afterward. He straightened his curtains. He bought a second coffee mug. He told Miguel on the first Sunday of January. Although Miguel's expression when he heard the news was the expression of a man who had been waiting quite some time to hear something he already knew. Good, Miguel said, with a thoroughness that contained 6 months of careful opinion held in reserve. I have not asked her yet, Phineas said. To marry, I mean, I want to do it properly. Give her time. She is not going anywhere, Miguel said. Her foundation is set in good ground. I know, Phineas said. Then whenever it is right, it will be right, Miguel said. On a Saturday evening in late January, when the snow was deep and the nights were long and the two of them had fallen into the entirely natural habit of sharing supper alternately at her house and his, Lenora sat across from him at his table and said, without any preamble, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly. Always, he said. Do you see this as permanent, she said. What is between us? Do you see it as something you are building toward or something you are, she paused, choosing her word, enjoying for now? He looked at her steadily. Permanent, he said. She nodded. I wanted to be sure. You could ask me any day of the year and I would say the same thing, he said. Good, she said. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, I had intended to do this with considerably more ceremony, but since you've brought up the subject, he stood up from the table, which caused her eyes to go wide slightly, and he went to his bedroom and came back with a small worn box that had been in his possession for 7 years, and he sat back down and opened it across the table from her. Inside was a simple gold ring with a small oval setting, nothing extravagant, a ring he had bought long ago for another woman and had kept because throwing it away had felt like an erasure and giving it away had been impossible. This ring has a history, he said. I want to tell you that honestly. I bought it for Clara, and she never wore it, and I kept it. And I have thought about whether to use it or to get a different one, and what I keep coming back to is that Clara was part of my life and she mattered, and I do not want to pretend she did not. But this ring has never been worn. It has never been anyone's, and I would very much like it to be yours if you will have it. Lenora looked at the ring and then at him, and her expression was quiet and full and deeply considering. You are an honest man, she said. I am trying to be, he said. Then yes, she said, I will have it. He put the ring on her finger across the table and she turned her hand to look at it in the lamplight, and he thought she was the most extraordinary person he had ever known. Phineas, she said. Yes. I love you, she said, as directly and simply as she said everything. I love you, he said. Significantly. She laughed, and the lamp burned, and outside the snow lay deep and white over all of it, his land, her land, the shared creek running cold and clear between them. They were married in April. The wedding took place at Miguel's place, because it was the largest gathering space any of them had access to, and Miguel cooked for 3 days beforehand with the focused joy of a man who has been waiting years to have a reason to do so. The guests were Miguel and his grown daughter Esperanza, who had ridden up from Albuquerque with her husband and their 2 small children, the territorial clerk Aldous Webb and his wife, who had taken a friendly interest in the couple since their visit in December, and a small collection of other neighbors and nearby ranchers whom Phineas had known for years and who were, almost to a person, visibly astonished to see him in this circumstance and visibly pleased about it. The justice of the peace came from Santa Fe, a cheerful and efficient man who performed the ceremony under Miguel's big cottonwood tree, which was just coming into its spring green. The air smelled of new grass and warm earth. The mountains were still capped with snow. Lenora wore her blue wool dress and had fresh wildflowers tucked into her pinned hair, and she walked to where Phineas was standing under the cottonwood with the kind of calm and directness she brought to everything. And when they stood face to face waiting for the ceremony to begin, she looked at him with an expression that was so warmly and privately his that he felt it in the center of his chest like something taking root. The justice read the words. They said the words back. He put his hand around hers and felt the ring there. You may kiss your bride, the justice said, and Phineas did, carefully and with all the feeling he had been carrying since a beaver dam on an October afternoon, and the small group of people under the cottonwood made the sounds that people make when they are genuinely happy for someone. Miguel brought out his guitar after the food, and there was dancing on the packed earth of the yard, and at some point in the long, warm evening, Phineas found Lenora standing a little apart from the gathering, looking out toward the east where both their properties ran into the darkening sky. "Looking at your land," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Our land," she said, correcting him with a small sideways look that he chose not to argue with. "Our land," he agreed. He stood beside her in the easy way they stood together now, shoulders nearly touching, watching the evening come down over the territory. "What are you thinking?" She was quiet for a moment. "That I drove those stakes into the ground 8 months ago with no idea what I was driving them into," she said. "I had a plan, and the plan was clear and neat, and had nothing in it about a stubborn and quiet man on the property next door who lent me a post-hole digger and cleared a beaver dam and brought me firewood without being asked." She paused. "I am glad the plan was wrong." He took her hand. She leaned into him slightly, which she did sometimes when she was settled and content, a small and entirely instinctive motion that he had come to watch for. "I had given up expecting anything," he said. "That is what I want you to know. It was not that I was unhappy. I had just," he searched for the word, "closed things off, made it tidy. And then you came along and made a mess of all of it, and I find I am profoundly grateful." "I am a tidy person," she said with great dignity. "You turned everything over," he said. She tipped her face up at him. "Everything in a good way, I hope." He kissed her temple. "In the best possible way," he said. That spring, Phineas and Lenora worked both properties as a shared enterprise. Her land and his land operating together, with the shared creek as the center, and the shared labor of two people who were well matched in their capabilities and their will. He learned things from her. She knew more about kitchen gardening and about the management of draft horses than he did, and she had a sharp instinct about cattle health that she had developed from reading and from observation, and that was, to his quiet professional admiration, frequently better than his own. She learned things from him, the particular behaviors of the land through the seasons, the water patterns, the way the spring runoff ran, the best grazing rotation for his cattle, which she began to think of as their cattle. He expanded his herd by 10 head that spring, using money from the combined operation, and they converted 2 acres of her best bottomland along the creek into a proper kitchen and market garden, fencing it securely against deer and cattle. By summer the garden was producing with an abundance that surprised even Lenora, who had planned it carefully. The matter of Dodge Fruit resolved itself quietly in May, when the letter from Aldous Webb at the land office arrived, formal and definitive, confirming the downstream rights of both Hayes and Abbott, and as she had legally changed her name, Mrs. Lenora Hayes, and informing Prout that any interference with the waterway would constitute a violation of territorial law. Prout sent no response. He was seen at the trading post in town occasionally, and he was civil in a minimal way, and the matter was over. On a summer morning when the valley was green and the creek was running full, and the mountains were purple against a hard blue sky, Lenora told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen of their house. They had been living in his house since the wedding, which was the larger of the two, and had been steadily improving it, the curtains now straight and full, a proper kitchen table, her books beside his on the shelves above the fireplace, her coffee mug beside his by the wash basin. She had been up early, which he had noticed without comment, and when he came in from the morning chores she was standing at the stove with her back to him, and she turned around with a cup of coffee in each hand and said, with perfect Lenora Abbott matter-of-factness, "I believe we are going to have a child." He stood in the kitchen door with mud on his boots and looked at her. "In January, I think," she said. "From what I can calculate." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took the coffee cups from her hands and set them on the stove and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked, because she was the most important thing. "I am very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but well." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she put her hands over his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the summer morning kitchen with the coffee going warm behind them. "January," he said. January, she confirmed. He sat down at the kitchen table because his legs had gone slightly uncertain beneath him, and she sat across from him and pushed his coffee toward him and watched him with an expression that was fond and amused and deeply content. Are you frightened? She asked. Terrified, he said honestly. So am I, she said, but also she looked for the word. Also entirely glad. Entirely glad, he said. Yes, that is exactly the word for it. Miguel was told on the following Sunday, and his response was to be quietly and thoroughly overjoyed, which expressed itself in the immediate planning of specific foods. He intended to cook for them, and a lengthy opinion about the particular quilt he owned that had belonged to his wife, and which he had been saving for the right moment, and felt this was it. Lenora's pregnancy was strong and healthy through the autumn, and she maintained the work of the properties with modifications rather than cessation. She let Phineas take on the heavier lifting and did not argue about it, which was its own form of trust, and she redirected her considerable energy toward the interior preparations, which included converting the storage room that had been the spare room into a proper nursery, with a cradle that Phineas built himself over the course of October and November. Working in the barn by lamplight after supper. She came out to the barn one November evening and found him at it, the cradle halfway built, the lamplight warm and yellow, sawdust on the floor. She leaned in the doorway and watched him work for a while without announcing herself, and he heard her eventually and looked up. You did not have to stand there silent, he said. I was watching, she said. You are a better carpenter than you give yourself credit for. He ran his hand along the side rail he had just fitted. It will hold a child, he said. That is what matters. She came and sat on a hay bale nearby and watched him work, wrapped in her coat, her hands folded in her lap over the considerable and beautiful fact of their coming child, and they talked quietly about names, which they had been circling around for weeks, and about what kind of person this child might be, and about what they wanted for him or her. Which was a conversation that kept expanding outward until it included the kind of world they hoped to see, and the kind of people they hoped they themselves would become. And Phineas thought, not for the first time, that this was what he had not known how to want when he had been making his peace with the quiet, not just a companion or a warmth, but someone he could become more with, someone who made him larger. The baby came in January, as calculated, in the cold white middle of a January night with Miguel's daughter Esperanza present as midwife, having come up from Albuquerque 2 weeks early in anticipation. She had considerable experience, 4 children of her own, and a calm competence that Lenora trusted immediately. Phineas spent several hours in the main room of the house in a state of controlled anxiety that Miguel, who had come with Esperanza, managed with steady company and strong coffee and the occasional quiet word. When Esperanza came out of the bedroom and said, "You have a son, Mr. Hayes," Phineas Hayes stood up so fast he knocked his coffee cup off the table and did not notice. The boy was healthy and loud, with a remarkable amount of dark hair in his mother's eyes, and when Phineas was allowed in and Lenora put the baby into his arms for the first time, he sat on the edge of the bed and held his son, and felt a kind of full and ringing happiness that he had no prior frame of reference for, not like the quiet, not like the grief, not like anything. Something new. Something entirely new. "Hello," he said to the baby somewhat foolishly. The baby blinked at him with unfocused dark eyes. "His name," Lenora said from the pillow, exhausted and luminous. They had decided on names weeks ago, working through several candidates with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "James," Phineas said. "James Miguel Hayes." From the doorway, Miguel made a sound that was entirely unlike his usual composed reserve, and turned away to the window and looked out into the January night, and Esperanza put her hand on his shoulder. James Miguel Hayes came into the world in January of 1880. In a house in the New Mexico territory that had been improved and warmed and arranged with intention, in a valley where the mountains stood purple and permanent to the east, on land that had been claimed with purpose and worked with love, by people who had each in their own way made peace with a smaller life before finding their way to a larger one. The spring of 1880 was exceptional. The grass came in so thick and green in the valley that it looked, as Phineas had told Lenora it would, as though it had been painted. The creek ran full and clear from the winter snowpack. The garden they had planted together the previous year came in early and strong, and they added new beds along the creek margin, deep-soiled and well-watered, where Lenora planted things she had read about in a seed catalog from back east: tomatoes and pepper plants and winter squash, alongside the staple beans and corn. Phineas's herd was at 60 head and growing, and the joint operation of the two properties had developed an efficiency and a rhythm that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts. James, at 3 months, had become an interested and expressive personality, regarding the world from his mother's arms or his cradle with the dark-eyed attention that both his parents recognized as characteristic. He had Phineas's jawline and Lenora's eyes, and a completely unique set of opinions about his own schedule, which he expressed with considerable vigor, and which his parents found simultaneously exhausting and delightful. Miguel came every Sunday without fail, and it had become one of the anchored comforts of their week, Miguel in his chair on their porch, coffee in hand, James frequently in his arms, because Miguel had a gift with the baby that was beautiful to see, the easy competence of a man who had raised children and loved them, and still had all of that in him ready to be given. Phineas watched his old friend hold his son in the Sunday afternoon light, and thought about the ways a life could surprise you if you let it. In the summer, Lenora's younger brother Thomas came to visit from Ohio, a journey of nearly 2 weeks, by train to Albuquerque, and then by hired wagon north. He was 23, her brother, with Lenora's coloring and a personality that was somewhat less contained and considerably more talkative, and he arrived in the valley in a state of barely contained wonder at the landscape and the sky. "You built all this," he said to her, standing in the yard of the main house on the first morning, looking from the house to the garden to the barn to the fields. "We built all this," she said, with a gesture that included Phineas, standing nearby with James on his hip. Thomas shook Phineas's free hand with sincere feeling. "I did not know what to think when she wrote to us about all of this," he said frankly. "A woman alone in the territory. My mother was beside herself." He looked around again. "But I can see it now. I can see exactly what she chose." He stayed for 3 weeks, and proved useful in the way of a young man with good hands and a willingness to be directed. And by the end of his visit, he had made himself genuinely indispensable in 2 fence-mending projects and a barn repair, and had endeared himself to Miguel, who fed him extensively and with great satisfaction, and had been told by James, who was 4 months old and in a vocal period, several things that no one could entirely interpret, but that Thomas took as positive signs. On the morning he left, he hugged Lenora for a long time. "You look like yourself," he said, "more than I have ever seen." She stepped back and looked at him steadily. "I am," she said. "I really am." He hugged Phineas too, which slightly surprised Phineas and was entirely genuine. "Take care of her," Thomas said. "She doesn't need much taking care of," Phineas said, and caught Lenora's eye over Thomas's shoulder. "But I intend to be here for all of it regardless." Thomas laughed and got on his horse and rode down the valley, and they watched him go, the two of them standing in the yard with James between them, until the dust of his horse settled back into the summer air. The autumn of 1880 brought changes to the territory that touched them even at their remove. The final significant confrontations of the Apache Wars were ongoing to the south, in Arizona and southern New Mexico, and the news that came through Santa Fe and the trading post carried the weight of a people being pushed to the furthest edges of everything. Phineas and Lenora talked about these things at their table in the evenings, seriously, and with the care they had always given to the injustices that lay under the landscape they loved. They talked about the Pueblo peoples to the north, whose communities had endured so much for so long and maintained their own deep coherence. They talked about the Navajo people still rebuilding 17 years after the long walk. They talked about what it meant to be settlers on land with a history longer and more complex than their own claim on it. And they did not arrive at comfortable conclusions, but they sat with the discomfort rather than turning away from it. That, Phineas thought, was part of what it meant to actually love a place, not just the beauty of it but the full weight of it. James's first birthday came in January of 1881, on a cold, brilliant day with fresh snow on the ground, and the mountains white and enormous against a sky of perfect blue. They celebrated with Miguel and Esperanza, who had come up from Albuquerque again. She had by now made the trip enough times that the road was familiar to her, and with the Webbs from Santa Fe, who had become genuine friends over the 2 years since the Water Rights visit, and with several neighboring families who had observed the Hayes household come into being with warmth and interest. Miguel made tamales and a sweet rice pudding. Lenora made a cake, her first proper cake since moving to the territory, requiring an ingredient list that had taken months of careful ordering, a honey cake with dried fruit, and it was excellent. James, presented with a small portion of it, regarded it with the expression of a person encountering something entirely outside his existing conceptual framework, and then consumed it with serious and thorough enthusiasm, which was about as clear an evaluation of the cake as anyone could ask for. At the end of the celebration, when the guests were gone and James was asleep in his cradle and the house was warm and the fire was low, Phineas and Lenora sat side by side on their settle in front of the fire, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm around her, the way they sat most evenings. 1 year, she said. Of James, he said. Of James, she agreed. And 2 years and a few months of all the rest of it. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. Are you still glad the plan was wrong? He asked, echoing what she had said on their wedding day. She turned her face up at him, and her eyes in the firelight were warm and clear and entirely certain. Every day, she said. He held her there in the firelight and the quiet was entirely different now. It was full, not empty. It was chosen. It was the sound of a life he had not imagined but that had come to him in the form of survey stakes in the red earth, and a woman driving fence posts in the frost, and he would not have had it any other way. The land office document that hung now on the wall of their kitchen, the one that registered the water rights for the Hayes property and the former Abbott parcel listed now as Hayes East, though Lenora argued they should call it something better, was slightly crooked on its nail. Phineas had been meaning to straighten it for months. He never did, because Lenora found it charming in a way she could not fully explain, and he had long since stopped needing things to be perfectly tidy. He was, he thought, the kind of man who straightened ladders on uneven ground and who could not look at a person holding a frightened horse in a cold barn without feeling the whole trajectory of his life shift quietly and permanently on its axis. He was the kind of man who had made his peace with a quiet and empty life, because it had seemed the safest way to keep what was left of himself whole, and who had discovered, when a woman named Lenora Abbott filed a claim on the land next to his, and came driving up a dusty track in October with the reins of her team in her capable hands, and a look on her face like she was already home. That the safest thing he had ever thought he wanted was the smallest version of a life that had turned out to be capable of being so much more. In the spring of 1882, Lenora was expecting again, with the same matter-of-fact calm she brought to most things. This time it was Phineas who told Miguel, riding over on a Sunday morning with the specific walk of a man who has good news and is not yet sure how to carry it. Miguel looked at his face when he rode up and said, "Another one." "Another one," Phineas said. Miguel stood up from his chair and embraced him in the way of a man who had known him long enough to know exactly how much this meant. "Good," he said, into Phineas's shoulder. "Very good." The baby came in October, a girl this time, with Phineas's dark hair and Lenora's voice, that clear carrying quality that made itself known from the first moment. They named her Clara Rose, and Lenora had suggested the name herself, quietly and directly, One evening when they were discussing it, "I would like her to be Clara," she had said. "If you are willing," and Phineas had held her eyes for a long moment and felt something finally and gently complete. "Yes," he had said. James, who was almost 2, received his sister with the uncertain but ultimately benevolent interest of a small person encountering a new category of thing. And by the time Clara was a month old, he had developed a proprietary and protective attachment to her that was expressed primarily through placing his toy horse beside her cradle as a guard detail, and reporting to his parents at intervals on her condition, in a language mostly his own. Miguel came to see Clara on the first Sunday after she was born, and when Lenora put the baby in his arms, the old man sat in his chair by the window and looked at her for a long time without saying anything, and the expression on his face was the sum total of a life that had known loss and joy and patience, and was now receiving something that felt like completion. "She looks like her name," he said finally. Phineas sat down across from him. Outside, through the window, the valley ran gold and red with autumn color, the cottonwoods blazing along the creek line, the mountains going purple in the afternoon. Lenora was in the kitchen making coffee, and the sound of it, the small domestic sound of her in their kitchen in their house, on their land, was the finest sound he knew. "We have been thinking about the eastern parcel," Lenora said from the kitchen, in a conversational tone, because she and Phineas talked through most things as they went about other things, and this was entirely usual. Whether to build properly on it, a tenant house perhaps, or a bunkhouse, if we want to bring on a hand to help with the herd. "Herd is getting big enough for it," Phineas said. "By spring we will need the help," she agreed, coming through with the coffee. She sat down and poured for all of them, and James climbed up on the settle beside her with the determined effort of a nearly 2-year-old, and she settled him against her side with one arm and handed Phineas his coffee and smiled at him across the room. He took the coffee. He looked at her. He looked at Miguel with his daughter in his arms. He looked at his son tucked against his wife's side. He looked at the window where the valley ran gold in the autumn and the mountains stood blue and enormous and permanent against the sky. He had made his peace with a quiet and empty life, and then everything had changed. He was glad, every day, that he had not been good enough at it to make it last. The evening settled around them, warm and full, in the house they had built together on the land that had been staked out on a cold October morning that now felt like the beginning of everything. The fire was lit, the children were close, the coffee was hot, and outside the New Mexico territory stretched in every direction under a sky full of stars, the same sky that had watched him ride home alone for 6 years, and that watched him now as part of something whole and permanent and good. Clara Rose slept in Miguel's arms. James told his mother something important in his private language, and she listened with complete attention, as she listened to everything. Phineas Hayes looked at his family and could not have told you, if pressed, when the precise moment was that the empty life had become this one. Whether it was the survey stakes, or the beaver dam, or the sound of a laugh in a cold creek, or the firewood, or the firelight, or the ring he had carried for 7 years coming home at last. He suspected it was all of it at once, the way a river is not one drop of water but all the drops together, running in one direction, finding the sea. He put his coffee down and got up and went to stand beside Lenora, and she leaned into him the way she did, the small instinctive motion that meant she was content, and he put his arm around her, and the fire burned, and the stars turned outside, and in the valley the creek ran clear and cold between the 2 pieces of land that were now and forever one.